take a seat, that'd be great. Welcome to our fifth keynote of our conference, Querying Labor. My name is James Compton. I teach here in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies. I'm also one of the core organizers. Oh, and I see our third panelist has just arrived just in time, so that's great. We've got three communication scholars up to talk about labor, which should be very, very interesting for us. And over lunch, my colleague Glenn Findley made the remark, which I thanked him for because he gave me my anecdotal lead, and I'm always looking for one, is that the keynote this morning reminded him a bit of Engels' condition of the English working class. And I thought, well, that's interesting, that's right. And so, what better than to have three communication scholars of labor to kind of dig in a bit more on that theme. I'll introduce our speakers. We have Greig de Peuter. He's an associate professor of communication studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. His research interests include the political economy of communication, autonomous Marxism, labor, employment, and also the political economy of video games. We have Nora Loreto. Nora is an activist, writer, and musician based in Quebec City. She's also the author of From Demonized to Organized, Building the New Union Movement. She's also the editor of the Canadian Association of Labor Media. And we also have Todd Wolfson. He's an associate professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers, and his research focuses on the intersection of new media and contemporary social movements. He's also the author of Digital Rebellion. So we have three great panelists. I want to call on Greig first to come up and start us off. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you also to all the organizers for putting together this amazing event. It's a genuine honor to be asked to speak with you today. From creative economy to sharing economy, capitalist paradigms that celebrate cultural production and digital platforms as sources of post-industrial prosperity, engines of job creation, and sites of rewarding work have been roundly criticized for neglecting the precarity that is intrinsic to these paradigms. Job insecurity, compulsory entrepreneurialism, exclusion from social protection, the shifting of risk to individuals, lack of union protection, pressure to work for no or low pay, the imperative to be always on, and inequalities rooted in class, race, gender, and age are now well-documented features of work in the cultural and creative industries, where unpaid internships, freelancing, digital piecework, self-employment, and other deviations from the fraying model of the standard employment relationship are widespread. It's no wonder then that cultural workers, especially those outside a standard employment relationship, are often characterized as model subjects of neoliberal exploitation or as victims of precarity. In my talk, however, I want to position cultural workers differently, as agents in resistance and as builders of alternatives. In media and cultural studies, scholars have dismantled romantic myths about creative labor and independent work, documented diffuse, precarious employment in the cultural and creative industries, and assessed the risks and the rewards of media and cultural work. While this literature defies simple summary, there's a clear tendency in it to devote less attention to how workers in creative industries fight back, how they respond collectively to structural pressures on their work and livelihoods. The research that I want to speak to today shifts attention to collective efforts to expose, resist, and mitigate precarity in the arts, in media, and in other cultural sectors, manifesting differentially across social locations and geography. Precarity is mobilized here as a concept bound up with activism in which workers in standard employment are not the privileged actors, and rehabilitating full-time, salaried jobs for life is not necessarily the highest objective. My presentation draws from an ongoing research project called Cultural Workers Organize, which I collaborate on with my colleagues Enda Brophy, Nicole Cohen, Kate Oakley, and Marisol Sandoval. Over the past 5 years or so, we've been surveying collective responses to precarity in the creative economy. Our fieldwork has primarily been in Toronto, New York, London, Milan, and Berlin, where we've interviewed about 100 union organizers, labor activists, as well as members of professional associations, worker cooperatives, and co-working spaces. Broadly, we explore how workers who are dispersed and who are outside of an employment relationship, so freelancers, interns, the self-employed, join forces, push back, and present solutions in the face of precarity, or financial, social, and existential insecurities that are exacerbated by the flexibilization of labor under post-Fordism. Now, framing our inquiry is the autonomist concept of recomposition, deindustrialization, deunionization, destandardization of employment, disaggregation of production, among other processes of post-Fordist transformation, have contributed to the decomposition or the undermining of earlier sources of counterpower and income security among relatively privileged segments of the Fordist workforce. Viewed through the optic of recomposition, however, the restructuring of work and accumulation processes does not irrevocably exhaust the capacity for labor dissent, but instead reshuffles its actors, remixes its organizational forms, and revises its demands. Precariously employed workers in the cultural and creative industries are, we contend, among the protagonists of a recomposition of labor politics underway. So guiding recent critiques of media and cultural labor are terms like self-exploitation and individualization. Approaching cultural work from collective action, though, requires a revised conceptual lexicon. So our project also tests out conceptual frameworks for investigating cultural work beginning from resistance. Alternative labor organizations points to emerging worker associations at the margins of established trade unions to advocate for non-union workers who do not neatly fit the template of workplace-based organizing and are a key force of labor movement revitalization. Autonomous communication refers to struggles over the meaning of work and employment, the development of collective labor identities, the design of counter-publicity campaigns, and the use of digital platforms, all in the context of collective organizing. Policy from below signals worker-developed and worker-centered regulatory proposals to counteract precarity. And finally, mutual aid tags innovations from co-working spaces which provide informal support to the self-employed through to commons-oriented infrastructures like worker co-ops and occupied cultural spaces which strive to democratize work and collectivize value in a post-capitalist politics. So this afternoon, what I want to do is simply provide a series of snapshots of 5 collective efforts to contest organized economic inequality in the cultural and creative industries. And the first one is WAGE. WAGE is an alternative labor organization founded by artists in New York in 2008. Its project is to introduce artist fees at US-based nonprofit art institutions. Early on, WAGE used art world communication platforms to spread the open secret that artists are rarely compensated in a consistent, transparent manner, if they are paid at all, for their contributions to exhibitions and events that galleries are mandated to present. Wage highlighted that art institutions have budget lines for staff salaries, but not necessarily for artist fees. And they further disputed the promise of exposure as an illegitimate form of payment, contending that it reduces artists to market speculators. Wage went on to run surveys to gauge the scope of the non-payment problem. To whom, though, do artists address their demands, especially when they're not in an employment relationship and when they're so dispersed? Wage's strategy is to certify galleries that pay fees, engaging art institutions not only as antagonists, but also as potential allies in raising labor standards. Organizer Lee Soscone describes Wage as administrative direct action. Developing policy from below, Wage assembled artists and researchers and administrators to discuss principles toward payment standards. They went on to create the Wage Fee Calculator, an online tool to assist institutions in calculating minimum fees based on variables like their total operating expenses. Launched in 2014, Wage certification is basically a seal of approval on galleries that meet Wage's minimum rates. Through certification, Wage produces a quasi-employer with whom it can negotiate and hold to account. So far, Wage has certified about 40 nonprofit galleries. Wage, says Soscone, cracks open a problem. Artists need to learn to value their work from the point at which they enter the sector. If you don't have a minimum, you have no place to start from, end quote. Longer range, Wage is pushing for institutional commitment to equity in the distribution of funds across all gallery workers, from artists to curators, custodial staff, and art handlers. Writes Wage, quote, "When Wage calls out the non-payment of artists in the nonprofit sector, we're calling out a symptom, one simple sign of pervasive and systemic economic injustice." Until recently innocuous, the figure of the intern, my next example, has been strikingly politicized. An intern labor rights movement burst on the scene in the early 2010s, rejecting the ageist cliche, pay your dues, replacing it with the injunction, pay your interns. Take, for example, locally, the Canadian Intern Association. The idea for this advocacy group was floated among friends and graduated to a domain name. Searchable, its law student founder, Claire Seaborn, soon became a go-to media source on unpaid internships, long normalized in so-called glamour sectors. Mostly outside unions, interns have assembled in groups like Intern Aware in the UK, Intern Labor Rights in the US, and Generation Précaire in France. Their repertoire of tactics spans protests, clever campaigns, lobbying government, and proposing policy, helping interns file claims for wage theft, outreach and education, and vitally, media relations, enabling reporters to source intern activists as spokespeople who are backed by online presence and deliver well-packaged sound bites. Activists have effectively shaped the arguments that are circulating against unpaid internships. They privilege the wealthy, capitalize on young workers' passions, undervalue young workers' labor, reinforce inequalities, break the law when they misclassify employees entitled to minimum wage, and train indebted graduates to have few expectations of employers. Intern activists are especially adept at naming and shaming. Claire Seaborn tells of exposing one shady unpaid internship posting of the Canadian social media firm Hootsuite. Quote, "Within 30 hours of posting the contracts on our wall of shame, I got an email from the CEO saying, 'We're going to fix this. We can see that this is a problem.' They retroactively paid their interns 6 months prior," end quote. One intern activist suggests, though, that there's a risk to this whistleblower-style tactic. Quote, "It's as if you don't need to organize," end quote. Intern activists do, however, converge in, for example, the Global Intern Coalition. I want to offer just a footnote to this snapshot about intern activism. 3 days ago, the Canadian government released the federal budget, which proposes to, quote, limit unpaid internships in federally regulated sectors, end quote, and seeds that some internships are exploitative. So this policy change and the word choice is the product of sustained pressure from below. Freelancers in creative industries increasingly use co-working spaces where members pay a fee to access a desk, shared office amenities, professional events, and contacts that might lead to paid gigs. In the 2000s, co-working's early iterations were worker-developed, highly informal, frequently free, linked to activism, and marginal to capital accumulation. And they enabled mutual support among workers without an employer-provided work site. Inside a decade, however, capital harnessed co-working. There are now some 8,000 co-working spaces in 80 countries, populated by solo operators looking to temper the isolation of working from home and for a break on office rent. Whether by housing the outsourced or formalizing network sociality, co-working spaces ultimately make a flexible labor regime work better. Co-working spaces reinforce the processes whose effects they are a partial defense against. That is, they react to and facilitate the fragmentation of employment into so many gigs, the rise of involuntary entrepreneurialism, and the restructuring of firms according to a contracting out model. So capital benefits from co-working by offloading the costs of maintaining a flexible labor regime. But it also draws value from co-working as a fresh site of accumulation. Emblematic here is the co-working franchise WeWork, flush with venture capital, valued at some $16 billion and jockeying for position in urban commercial property markets. In its predominant form, co-working is a commodity. It is a service for which customers pay a fee, inviting flexibilized workers to buy back access to workplace community. To challenge systemic forces underpinning their members' precarity requires co-working spaces to become sites for collective organizing, and experiments along these lines are emerging. Activists in Europe have tested out co-working spaces as political meeting houses toward a freelancers' rights movement, and co-working spaces in Ontario have also extended protections to freelancers by offering benefits plans, and there are also some co-working spaces that have begun to offer childcare. So these services make meaningful improvements in self-employed workers' livelihoods, but they uphold a basic power imbalance. Individuals shoulder the costs of social reproduction. So to push back against recuperation and against individualization, co-working must explore alternatives to capitalist ownership conventions, which is not as improbable as it might seem. There are a number of different institutional models within the co-working sector, including a small but growing subset that are organized as member-owned worker cooperatives. So, can cultural workers' collective responses to precarity extend to building economic organizations alternative to prevailing forms of organized economic inequality? So here our research begins to explore worker cooperatives. Businesses owned and controlled by those who work in them, worker co-ops in theory value mutual aid, economic democracy, dignity at work, and member participation. Some co-working spaces, as I mentioned, are structured as cooperatives. Exercising radical imagination, however, it's possible to envision wholly new kinds of co-working spaces that perhaps are incubators of worker co-ops. And a glimpse of this kind of possibility is Open Co-op, a shared workspace of cultural sector co-ops in Amsterdam. Nascent groups are also advocating for freelancers to join together in co-ops, encouraging independence to go together rather than alone. Digital Commons talk is also dovetailing with a new generation of tech co-ops, from Stocksy, the stock photography co-op in Vancouver, to the web developer Outlandish in London, England. This ascendant label for this activity is platform cooperativism, which presents worker co-ops as a promising model for wresting control from digital media monopolies. But since it's not the platform that's cooperative, but rather the work and the wealth that it generates, it's necessary to better understand how, if at all, co-ops improve employment quality, wealth distribution, and social equity. Do the new digital co-ops, for example, challenge or mirror the white-dominated composition of the tech workforce? Are worker co-ops a place to build a sustainable career and participate in economic activism? Worker co-ops that have sustained themselves over a long period of time are really instructive here, I think, like the 30-year-old strong Calvert's Cooperative, which is a design and printer co-op in London, England. One of the longest serving members of this cooperative, Sean Whelans, offers this: I don't see cooperatives as we know them as a vehicle for overcoming capitalism. I see them as a tactical and strategic response from workers within capitalism, with the question of how do we ameliorate our conditions? How do we come together to meet our common social, cultural, and economic needs in this context? Having said that, I think in as much as overcoming capitalism will require a huge amount of confidence and organization, worker co-ops are the kinds of places and space where that kind of confidence and organization can start to be practiced. One of the limits of the alternative labor organizations that I've been describing is a lack of collective bargaining rights. So my final snapshot describes unionization in a sector where precarity is pervasive, digital media, which ruling wisdom had suggested is ideologically incompatible with unionism. Last summer, about 200 Vice Canada media workers joined the Canadian Media Guild, a 6,000-member media worker union. First contract negotiations are currently underway. Now, Vice is a private company valued at some $4.5 billion with a presence in 30 countries and some 2,000 employees. It spans a magazine, dozens of themed websites, and now a 24-hour television channel. Carefully crafted irreverence and youth culture are its trademarks, but Vice also delivers to millennials investigative journalism on topics from indigenous resistance to climate change. Vice's golden goose, however, is its in-house ad agency called Virtue. Very clever. So sponsored content is the specialty of Virtue. But if Vice's profits depend on its audiences accepting monetization and embracing brands, Vice's employers have proved to be less acquiescent to other features of digital capitalism. Based in Toronto, the Vice Canada Union Drive was self-organized by young workers with no previous organizing experience, whose jobs included writing stories, producing video, and managing social media. As they organized, grievances piled up, from pay to hours, fairness to benefits. And all the signs indicated that Vice was thriving, from announcements of massive investments through to reports of its CEO splurging on $40,000 bottles of wine, a very subtle reminder of Vice's binary class order. Vice Canada workers were stirred, though, when the gossip website Gawker went union in 2015. Gawker blazed a trail with editorial staff at more than 10 US publications, swiftly following suit, from Salon to The Root to Huffington Post. Vice Canada workers decided to join this digital newsroom organizing wave when their Vice US counterparts unionized. Staff chose the Canadian Media Guild, completed a drawn-out card-signing process, and voted with a generous majority to unionize. The Vice Canada campaign displays some enduring solidarity values. Staff hope to use the union to improve the lot of their freelancer colleagues who are barred by law from organizing, And also, if vice media workers tend to be generationally predisposed to job hopping, this didn't stop them from making their workplace better for the time being and enabling more sustainable livelihoods for those who would succeed them. So these snapshots that I've given of collective responses are inspiring, are modest, are uncertain, are rife with tensions and gaps, and they face significant challenges. But nonetheless, I think that they do dispute the imagined solidity of the creative economy and the false egalitarianism of the sharing economy, and help to reframe these paradigms as sites of labor conflict and hence for alternative possibilities. Thank you.
I don't have anything, yeah. All right. I'm really happy I got to go after Greig, because that's, you just described like my work life. I'm a member of the executive of the Canadian Freelance Union, and this is what I deal with unpaid every day as we get people begging us for help to get paid up with contracts, and as we try to continue to build our capacity. It's a project of Unifor. But I am not talking about that. I'm instead going to be talking about labor and what it's going to take to fix labor in Canada. Okay, so to start, I'm not an academic, and I was a punk musician, so I'm going to try to melt your faces today, and hopefully at least stimulate some conversation for the rest of the conference. And I hope to also finish the circle that was started this morning in Kate's presentation talking about inequality, because there was a lot of questions that were left open, I think, for Canadians, which is, what do we do? I'm going to solely focus on unions. Social movements play a really critical role, but the talk is called Querying Labor. And so I'm going to focus on how unions are failing and what they need to do to help, stop the runaway freight train of disaster that we see at all levels of government. It was mentioned earlier, I wrote a book. I have the book for sale with me, so if you want to throw some money to the CCPA, you can get the book from me for $20. If you want the book for free, you can just email me and I'll send it to you. Can you tell I don't make any money off the book? Whatever. Okay. So to start, as I said, I'm a freelancer and I work as a volunteer of the Canadian Freelance Union. But most of my work is with union activists, and the range of union activists I work with, it's quite amazing. It's folks who work in national communications departments for the largest unions in Canada, and folks who build planes or teach or watch children, and who were voluntold to make the union newsletter. And so the range of experiences is really amazing. And that's through the Canadian Association of Labour Media. But I come to the labor movement with the young eyes, I guess, of the student movement, which I have never been able to shed since having left the student movement where I worked and organized for 10 years. And doing work within the student movement was amazing, because it was the tier of society that was so marginalized in the mainstream press, that was always hearing the messages from the Globe and Mail and the National Post about what it is they experience, and it couldn't have been more different from their reality, from our reality, right? So we would hear these mixed messages about how we were selfish, how we're entitled, how we're all this kind of bullshit that the Globe Mail tries to force into our bodies. And on the ground, you talk to students, and students are like, no, we're not like that. We do care. We do care about war. Yeah, I care about war. Do you like war? No, war is bad, right? So there's a kind of a baseline that we were able to start with. People were very engaged. There was an engagement. And so as I grew up and started to do more work within the labor movement, I started to write a lot more and investigate how do you characterize the crisis in unions today? And I think if I asked everyone in this room what the problem within the labor movement is, you would all have 10 answers. right? There are many, many, many problems within the labor movement. And so this talk is going to try to characterize those problems, talk about the solutions that we have available to us, and how and why it is imperative that we get our shit together to try and actually, make some positive change. Okay, so in my mind, there are two crises that we need to confront within labor. There is a generational crisis, and there is a crisis of consciousness and role. And I'm going to first start with the generational crisis because I like talking about that a lot. If you're a friend of mine on Facebook, you know that I like to shit on baby boomers. I do it in jest, and so this is not going to be a presentation that does that. The first crisis that we need to figure out in labor is the crisis of leadership, where it is very difficult for someone of a younger generation to get involved into roles of leadership. And that becomes difficult because all of a sudden, when you get into collective bargaining situations, you're often ignored. And so we see a lot of young people getting active in the labor unions that they have access to, which are often TA or GA unions on campus. But when you are in a job where you might be the precarious worker, you might be the summer worker because you're also in school still, and you have the same voice as someone who's been, at the city, let's say, for their entire career. You're trying to fight against some concession in collective bargaining, and the guy who's there longer than you tells you to basically, sorry, we can't help you. All of a sudden, that magnified city by city and contract by contract creates a disenfranchisement where young workers do not see themselves reflected in collective agreements. And then that gets more generalized, which is like, what's the worst thing about unions from the young person's perspective? It's, well, they protect lazy older workers and I can't get a foot in the door, right? Which of course is right-wing rhetoric, but it is rhetoric that we hear all the time. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have a crisis of pensions and a crisis of life being more difficult for older workers than it has been in the post-war period. And so we have pensions that are being bought out, or that are the pension contributions are disappearing. And workers are very, very frightened. They're working longer than ever before. People who had saved up their entire life to hopefully spend some time with their grandchildren before they die are finding out that actually they will never be able to have that retirement. And so we've got two conflicting forces. One is built in the post-war understanding of what Canada was, and one is built in the neoliberal, economic, social, political neoliberal Canada of what it is today. And those two worlds, to try and get them to speak to each other, is the biggest difficulty on the left, and it's the biggest difficulty within the labor movement, I think. So finding ways to explain these differences in words that we understand has to be at the heart of some of the way that we imagine union renewal. How do we talk about the fact that student debt is now at a crisis level, it's a level higher than it's ever been in Canadian history since we actually created a public system, without without automatically meaning that it's I have it worse, you have it worse, when we're this weird pissing match of who has it worse. The generational stuff is what I talk a lot about. And I'm going to actually not talk any more about it here because I think that that's enough for this group, but we can maybe talk about in the questions. But the other really big issue that I think that a conference like this has the capacity to grapple with is what is the role of the labor movement in a democracy? And it's such a basic question, and it's a question that I'm sure you all have the answer to, but we so rarely see unions in this country fulfill the role that they need to fulfill in a democratic space. And so what do I mean by that? We had 10 years of Stephen Harper, where the majority conservatives governed with no opposition. They structurally had no opposition to stop them from doing everything that we remember that they did. And maybe there's some things we forgot, right? We the people, the only way that we were able to stop anything was through direct action or through civil disobedience, or we weren't able to stop it, right? That's where we were under Stephen Harper. In that context, it was clear what the labor movement needs to do. The labor needs to fight, labor movement needs to fight, labor activists need to fight, the left needs to fight. We are always fighting, but because the attacks were so vicious, we were also always under attack. And so labor still wasn't able to figure out how to harness the power that it has to fight against Stephen Harper. So, and that was the context in which I wrote my book. And so I write the book, and then the conservatives get de-elected, and which isn't a word. And I was like, oh no, my book is totally useless now because everything's going to change, right? Well, lucky for me, Nothing changed. So now we have a liberal government. And a lot of what I'm saying also applies to provincial governments too, which is like kind of useful from a rhetorical position, but like really shitty from like a living reality kind of position. And of course, I'm based in Quebec, and so I've got the Quebec Liberals, Ontario Liberals are ruling us as I speak. But under Justin Trudeau, the labor movement has it even harder, right? Because Trudeau is popular, which is completely appalling to me, but it's true. Like the labor leadership is very friendly with Justin Trudeau, but I was at a Unifor convention, and that guy was mobbed by 500 big dudes who were like, "I love you, Justin Trudeau," right? Like it was really amazing to see there is real, palpable support for the Liberals, despite the fact that they are effectively the exact same as Stephen Harper. And so this has been massively disorienting for the labor movement and has been massively disorienting for the left. And part of solving some of the crises that are inherent on the left is trying to pierce through the common understanding of why Trudeau is popular and why he should not be popular. At the same time, we have a situation in Canada where we have experienced unprecedented attacks on civil liberties in kind of like broad society on the left, right? Canada is a country that is built illegally, so already we are built on civil non-liberties, injustice, that's the word. The Indian residential school system was mass oppression and genocide. But if we think in Canada of the moment where civil liberties were the most under attack, there's a certain generation that would immediately say 1970, right? There's a generation that would say it was the War Measures Act to respond to the FLQ crisis. But in the 2000s, the early 2000s, the 2010s, and now, we have seen an increasing attack on civil liberties that is I'm sure is concerning you as much as it concerns me. For example, during the G20, 1,100 people were arrested. People in this room were probably arrested, right? Some of us got smoked by cops. Some of us got arrested. People were pre-arrested, right? Preemptively arrested. And until that moment, that was the biggest attack on civil liberties during protest. And then you fast forward to 2012, which was the student strikes, and more than 3,000 students were arrested in the streets of Quebec, mostly in Montreal. Right, and people were arrested for very minor things, right? Marching in a group of more than 50 people without getting permission from the police. That created a rise in using laws to change how we express our civil disobedience in this country. So we saw laws enacted to make it like 25 years in jail if you're caught tampering with critical infrastructure. Right, with no definition for what critical infrastructure is. So tampering with that can be anything from blocking a highway to chaining yourself to a pipeline. We have seen laws pass the federal government that makes it illegal for you to wear a mask at a protest, right? As if it is already not illegal to put on a clown mask and walk into a bank and rob the bank. That is illegal. It's illegal to rob the bank. It's illegal to put on a clown mask to rob a bank. But they increased that up to make it illegal with a maximum sentence of 10 years. Right, 10 years to wear a mask at a protest. And this was all done under Stephen Harper, which has not been undone. Today, 2 years ago, outside of my front door in Quebec City, I witnessed 100 students mass arrested for protesting in the night. And it got no coverage in Canada. These things are now mundane. I was placed under arrest on my front step, and I had to show the police my license to demonstrate that I lived there. It was by a chance of God that a protest erupted outside of my front door. This puts a chill on organizing, and because this is not a talk about social movements, I won't talk about what it does to social movement activists, but of course you can imagine. But where this impacts the labor movement is, well, there's a couple of ways. One, of course, if you cover your face at a protest because you don't want your boss to see you, because you don't want to get fired, there's a chill. If you are a worker on critical infrastructure and you go on strike, are you now going to be arrested for tampering with critical infrastructure? We don't know, right? So Collective bargaining is under widespread attack in Canada as well. We have seen countless times teachers in Ontario is a really good example where their collective agreement was just ignored and a contract was imposed on them, and then all of a sudden they were like, oh, shit, okay, cool. So these attacks are all connected, and the labor movement has not figured out how to press against it, and instead they have decided to make friends with the Trudeau Liberals, right? And these are tactical discussions. So I have about, how much time do I have left? Not much. Okay, so then my solutions part is going to be short. I do that on purpose. So the labor movement has to take stock of what it has at its disposal. First of all, it has democracy, right? The force of a democratic system can only be toppled by another democratic force. Whether or not that democratic force is in the streets through social movements, or it's like literal democracy because you're voting for local representatives, your presidents, or whatever, that is a mandate from the people to confront elected governments or politicians or whatever. You can do that through a variety of ways. Unions have money, they have buildings, and they have resources. They have collective bargaining, where you can demand certain things at the bargaining table to improve your lot, to improve other workers within your workplace that may not be part of your collective agreement, but you can do that work. There's education, right? A lot of women would never get into politics if they never had that political education within their unions on how to become elected. And the most important thing is a work stoppage. If we are serious about the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, why has there not been a general strike to insist that the Liberals implement the plan, right? These are very basic elements of the labor movement and of collective organizing. And considering that we face enormous crises, we face climate chaos, we face widespread inequality that's getting worse, we have Indigenous communities that cannot drink the water that comes out of their taps. We have absolutely got to figure out where we individually fit within this movement, whether it is inside your union or if you are outside of a union, how we force these organizations to do the work that they need to do. It requires pressure, and it requires pressure first at the grassroots within the rank and file. It requires leadership that is humble. My God, that is so important. And progressive, that will listen to the grassroots. It requires strong internal democracy, which is a process, and that is a process that is always going to have to be under construction. And it requires debate, which is something that the left really struggles with today. Nothing of what I'm saying is revolutionary. We all already have the tools. We just need to figure out what we need to have for breakfast to sustain us for the day's work ahead of us. Find the most effective thing that you can do wherever you're located, and we will start the revolutions from our workplaces. Thank you.
Hey everyone. Let's see if I can figure this out. Hey everyone, how's everyone doing? Good? So it's great to be here at this conference, and I want to thank, I'm humbled, as Greg said also, for the organizers for inviting me here to talk about my work, and particularly for Josh and Nick that made it an easy trip and an easy process. And I've really loved all the stuff I've been hearing. I've learned a lot since I've been here, and particularly two great co-panelists, so that's been really exciting. So currently I'm doing work that's focused on Uber and the gig economy, and how Uber is changing the nature of work and class, and particularly the way workers organize themselves, which I think fits really well with some of the stuff we heard, but it's new in the field, and I'm not ready to share it yet, so you're gonna, maybe in Q&A we can talk about it. But today, instead, I'm gonna talk about some other work that's focused on the role of media and communications in building a broad and unified, class-infected and inflected social movement in Philadelphia. Specifically, I'm going to look at how a people's assembly, and groups involved in that assembly have harnessed media and communications, among other tools, to bridge the distance between the multiple subject positions, all the different kinds of people and experiences that make up the urban working class, particularly in Philadelphia. The main organization I'm going to look at is a relatively young group called 215 People's Alliance. 215 is the area code for Philly. But I'm also going to look at a more established group called Media Mobilizing Project and the way they've worked together to do this work. In specific, I'll look at how they use media to coordinate across struggles and organizations to begin to build a shared identity of struggle. And to get to a point that Dr. Shiva made last night, use media to break the many silos that exist in the city that make it really difficult to organize across those silos. So I'm going to argue, the bigger argument I'm going to make today is that media and communications can is a big word here because it can be overused, but it can have the power to shape it and organize social relations within and across movements. And the last thing I'll say before I jump in is that I've been involved with both organizations, both as an organizer and in researching them. So, there's questions about engaged scholarship that I'm happy to talk about. So 215 People's Alliance came into existence in 2015, and there were two things that catalyzed its development. At one level, there were a series of discussions in the US and Canada focused on the need to build independent political organization at the urban scale. These conversations focused both on forging an independent, cross-sectoral, and cross-racial base of working people. That's been some of the argument. And then the other part of the argument was to build an alignment of forces, what Gramsci might call a hegemonic bloc or a social bloc, aligning the institutions that represent those forces. This discussion was led by folks like Bill Fletcher, Fernando Gapacin, Sam Gindin here in Canada, and more recently, Jane McAlevey. And these discussions led to real projects, some of them here, some still around, some not around anymore. Greater Toronto Workers Assembly, Minnesotans for a Fair Economy, the Right to the City Network, and the Jackson Plan, which was spearheaded by the Malcolm X grassroots movement in Mississippi, and it was discussed in the previous presentation. So in Philadelphia, we're watching this, and it definitely influenced how we were trying to step forward. I'm going to have to admit, some of my slides, it's a Mac PC thing, and the words aren't showing up. My apologies. But nonetheless, at the same time in Philadelphia, organizers focused on labor, education, immigration, gentrification, and media came together, and we did a collective analysis of the political terrain. What's working, what's not working, and why. Three things became clear. One, there's a lot of organizing in the city of Philadelphia. A lot of organizing is going on, but it's isolated and it's in pockets and sectors, and there's very little bigger coalition building that's happening. And then if you step back and you look at the balance of forces of working class institutions, they're really weak in relationship to corporate power, for instance, amongst other things. So that was one thing we saw pretty clearly. A second thing we saw, and this goes to the last panel, or the last presentation, is that the labor movement in Philly was on the defensive. There had not been a new unit with new union members in the city of Philadelphia from something like 2005 to 2012. So there was like no new union organizing at the same moment that the bigger unions like the teachers union and the public sector unions were shedding members because of austerity policy. And the other thing about the labor movement in this case was that it was not joining with the community. So there was very little leadership from the labor movement, right? They were in a defensive posture, didn't know how to build with community, and all of their fights and all of their decisions were least common denominator decisions. The third thing that we saw was that the Central Labor Council, which is supposed to be the space where all the labor unions in Philadelphia come together, was at best ineffective, if we're being really generous. I hope there's no Philadelphians in the labor movement here. But more likely, it was politically regressive. That's the reality. And the reality was the Philadelphia labor movement. Philadelphia is known as a labor town, but it's dominated by the building trades. And the building trades have a very different set of interests than a lot of other labor movements. So these realities in Philly and the broader move that we were seeing towards assemblies led us to focus on building a working people's assembly that would prioritize building an independent base of working people while aligning leaders and institutions in the city to build a united front to fight for power in the city. Enough of a bunch of movements in the city, we wanted to fight for the city. So, in this sense, 215 People's Alliance is a people's assembly focused on building a local united front organization that coalesces around demands that advance a program that challenges the corporate domination of the city. The focus of 215 PA is to organize an independent base of membership made of African American community, the growing immigrant community, and rank and file members, particularly out of service sector unions and public sector unions, because those are the two parts of labor that are under the biggest attack and therefore are the most likely to move right now. So those, we strategically targeted them. And while we tried to build our own independent base, we were also trying to align those forces, right? So we were building with the public sector unions, building with the service sector unions, and we've also been working to align that with immigrant organizations, young people organizing in churches and around Black Lives Matter, et cetera. And so our program at the moment, just to give you an example, there's 3 layers to it. One is we're trying to win back local control of our schools, which have been taken over by the state, and then force a contract for the teachers. At a second level, we're fighting to force the city to divest from Wells Fargo because of the pipeline access, but also because Wells Fargo has cheated our city and our schools out of $162 million in swap deals. And then we're working in the DA's race. So we do engage electorally in moments. And so as part of this process of building this Working People's Assembly, we partnered with Media Mobilizing Project, which has been around a little bit longer, and we decided we wanted to use media above and on top of our organizing and the other work we were doing to try to build collective identity across these different parts. So I'm going to spend a little time, or the rest of the time, talking about that. And first, I'm going to tell a quick story. So on a Sunday in March, a year or two ago, 17 budding videographers congregated in Brewery Town in North Philly for their 3rd day of a day-long class to learn basic video and web skills. The workshop focused on Philadelphia's growing population of immigrants, as well as low-wage workers coming from service sector unions, SEIU and Unite Here. We also worked with the Taxi Workers Alliance, which is an independent worker organization, and then a bunch of immigrant organizations. Ranging in age from 20 to 60 years old, the students came as Besso Amori, an Eritrean immigrant and cab driver, explained, to learn how to use video and the internet to tell our stories and build our fight. The class, an 8-week effort to build both the skills and hardware for students to amplify their voices in the digital age, was a mixture of political education and media literacy, videography, and journalism skills. On this Sunday, the students checked out a bunch of documentaries, and then they went out in teams and they made a couple documentaries on criminal justice and gentrification in the neighborhood. All right, so the class ends. And at the end of the class, 6 high school students, Black high school students from the Philadelphia Student Union, come to Shanghai City Cultural Center where the class is being held, and they come armed with audio equipment. The students had been in a radio workshop about a month prior, and they had developed a show called On Blast, which was a radio show for young people on a low-power FM station. And they came that day because they wanted to interview cab drivers about an impending one-day strike. The students took turn asking the cabbies questions about their working conditions, and they were doing this to be able to create this news story, but it also created this really, to go to the lunch question of solidarity, it created this beautiful moment of solidarity, a new moment of solidarity, like the seeds, right? So at the end of the interviews, one of the students turns to me and she says, wow, I had no idea how connected my struggle over equitable education is to the struggle of cab drivers in the workplace. So they made 2 different things out of those interviews. One, they made a news story for their radio show, but they also made a 30-second PSA for the cab drivers, and they and the cab drivers used that PSA to build support for the one-day strike. And I'll say that the students came out for the strike, they participated in it, they participated in a rally involved in it, and since then, and you can see from the picture there, the cab drivers have taken leadership in fighting over education issues too, right? So you can begin to see how solidarity here is beginning to emerge. So to me, the Sunday opens a window onto the many ways that media and communication can play a connective role for groups fighting over the many expressions of capitalist domination in the age of austerity, both in the contemporary city and beyond. During the workshop, low-wage workers and immigrants came together to watch documentaries, learn video skills, and work together to create and share stories. Later, cab drivers and teenagers share stories of struggle, collaborate on media production. These connections between taxi workers and students, between filmmakers and immigrants, are the exchanges that motivate 215 People's Alliance, and it's part of the program they built with Media Mobilizing Project. The aim is to use media as a bridge conjoining movements from the fragmented urban landscape in an effort to build a shared movement, a movement to take the city. Sorry. So before I go on, I want to make 3 theoretical points here that undergird this argument about how 215 PA is harnessing media to forge a shared identity across the multiple sectors of the working class in the city. First, following E.P. Thompson, in this work, I argue that class identity or class consciousness emerges through structured processes. By this, I mean that while people structurally determined objective conditions are key to creating a set of shared social circumstances, precarious working conditions, debt, criminalization, police brutality, underperforming public schools, while that's real, it is also through a set of collectivizing processes that classes of people begin to recognize their common conditions. And that's often understood as through struggle, but I'm going to say it also can be through narrative practice to a degree. Second, and this is quite obvious, capitalism changes over time and across space. And to that end, across the last 40 years, urban U.S. cities, Canadian cities as well, have deindustrialized and work as largely service sector, temporary, casualized, gigified, and precarious. The urban cyber proletariat is more isolated than industrial workers of previous periods. The outcome is fragmented and segregated neighborhoods and a growing number of people living in poverty that are both isolated and disengaged from the political process. Given their atomized positioning, urban workers face a more difficult prospect of cultivating relations and thus a different and more complex process of constructing class consciousness. So this is one of the reasons that we have a lot of movements in the city, but very little bigger coalitions. Third, building on these 2 points, building on the structured process of class formation and the changing nature of work and capitalism, I would argue that with the onset of a neoliberal informational form of capitalism, that we can recognize and should start to recognize an elevated role for media and communications in class formation. And I'm not talking about Jacobin here, right? It's a great magazine, I appreciate it a lot, but what I'm talking about is media and communications that's embedded in movements, that's speaking to, for, through, with those movements, right? So forgive me, I'm gonna quote Marx, and I apologize for that, but I need to bring out a point. So in 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Marx set out to use the French example to understand the difference in class unity between the peasantry and the proletariat. And so there's this off-cited passage from the 18th Brumaire I'm gonna pull out. The small holding peasants form a vast mass, the members of which live in similar conditions but without entering into manifold relations with one another. Their mode of production isolates them from one another instead of bringing them into mutual intercourse. The isolation is increased by France's bad means of communication and by the poverty of the peasants. And then he continues, insofar as there is merely local interconnection among these small holding peasants and their identity begets no community, no national bond, no political organization among them, they do not form a class. They are consequently incapable of enforcing their interest in their own name, whether through a parliament or convention. They cannot be represented. They cannot represent themselves. They must be represented. So the significance of this statement is that the lack of internal communication infrastructure and circuits of social cooperation of the peasantry is what hindered them from building power. So in this essence, the inability to communicate leads to an inability to build power. That's the argument he's making. So to return to Philly for a second, if we think about the urban landscape, as I marked before, in the last 40 years, it's deindustrialized. It was a textile city, right? We had big textile factories, but now we have a cab driver driving alone. We have somebody who's guarding a building largely alone. And in a sense, the conditions of these workers is much less dense. And it's in that prospect, given that point, that I'm arguing for this different conception of how media and communications can work. So the point then is that MMP and 215 try to use media and communications to serve as an infrastructural function for generating commonality between fractured sectors of the working class. And so there's this time-honored conception of media as the arm of the movement, right? You have a fully formed movement, and then you have this arm that spits out a message, right? That's how people think about the media usually in connection to movements. And so what I would argue today is we need to reconceptualize it more as a nervous system that bounds up the different parts of the movement and brings them into communication together. And I'll say a little bit more about this at the end, there's a real problem if we over-assess the role of media and communications. So I'm running out of time, but I want to mark 3 archetypal practices that MMP and 215 PA used. The first were they created, I knew I was going to lose the text. All right, but the first is they created communicative spaces where people would come together for trainings, they would do media screenings, and this would start to build, and it does start to build a sense of understanding between one another. So there are these communicative spaces. But another thing was, and this is the one where I want to show a video if I can figure it out, there are these narrative practices that they built where they would try to put different sorts of movements up against one another to show how they share struggle. So I'm going to show that if I can.
The floodwater stopped right in front of my door.
We come here day in and day out. People work extra shifts. We like what we do, otherwise we wouldn't stay there.
I was spared.
This is home. When my mom kicked me out, it's like I came here. If anything happened, like I came here.
De alguna manera u otra tengo fe en que en verdad se nos dé algo.
I see myself differently. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one.
I just wanted to show that, to bring out some of this work because it becomes a little abstract. So those are 5 movements in Philly. The Fight for 15 in the Union from fast food workers, undocumented folks fighting for the right to a driver's license, folks in a community group in Eastwick that are fighting against environmental racism, nurses fighting for patient safety, and students fighting for equitable education and a safe place to be, right? And so the way that worked, the way that project worked is we brought them all together, we made videos about each one, but then we also started to build a second level analysis to show how they were working together. And so this is one of the ways that media can play this role of being one of a set of strategies for building collective class identity. And so the last thing I'll say, and I marked this, but I want to make sure to mark it really clearly, is that this can be done, while I want to argue for the role of media, it can also be overdone, right? So media can play a really good role, but it also can be way over-assessed. So Dr. Shiva, she said last night that technology shouldn't become a god, it's got to be a tool, and that's exactly right. So the moment, in our early stages, we over-assessed how media could work. We didn't build a working people's assembly, and we tried to have the media organization hold the different relationships across the movements and try to hold the network. And we overemphasized media over community organizing or campaign building or collective bargaining, right? And it failed. It was a great project, but it failed. And so then we twisted it, and then we put it on top of and layered it on top of more strategic community organizing and labor organizing. And that is, so it has to stand with classic organizing strategies. You can't supplant them. And I'll leave it there. I've went over. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Todd. Now, we only have a few minutes, so, and because we want to ensure that the people following us have time, I'm going to be rigorous and not letting people go on beyond the 3 minutes we have. I mean it. I saw a hand up here. Sorry. Open up.
So one of the themes that seemed to me to maybe link the three talks, and thank you for this great panel, was the question of generation, which was invoked by two people and I think was also relevant to the third. And I'm wondering about the extent to which you think the possibility of organizing around a generational politics, to what extent is that a liberatory possibility, and to what extent does it reinforce the kinds of capture and co-optation that we saw at work in the co-working spaces, right? The alt-gen logo with the specific ages able to work there delimited, and the way in which age becomes kind of a fetishized commodity. To what extent does thinking about youth organizing counter that, and to what extent is there a danger of reinforcing that, if that question makes sense?
So any of you?
I guess I'll be really quick. I think I see organizing around age as organizing around other identities in terms of like a person of that group or people of that group are the ones who are going to understand what works best to reach that group. And so where you have a real problem is if there's an entire group that is ignored by decision makers, let's say in whichever structure you're working in, that you're going to have a message that doesn't reach people, period, right? And so I think making sure that if voices are making the decision of how to reach people of the same kind of voices, that's critical for progressive organizing. If it's one group of people trying to reach other people who they have no identity of or connections to, they're going to always miss them. And so kind of for me, it's just as basic as that.
Okay, we have one last question. I saw one hand. Len?
Just a brief comment and then question. The comment is to Todd. One should never apologize for quoting Marx. One should only apologize for not quoting or misquoting him. The passage you cite from the 18th Brumaire is in fact precisely compatible with another much maligned statement on the idiocy of rural life. When Marx talks about idiotismus as idiocy, he's talking about siloed selfhood, which radically restricts the capacity for communication that is an essential precondition for social mobilization. So that the two, if they're read together, I think, bring out the message much more powerfully. My question is, if you query labor is to recenter production and its conditions rather than the capacities of consumption, what kinds of intergenerational production scenes do you three imagine? And particularly in the case of the university, because to use the term intergenerational is to put the notion of the generative and the processive in there, and to defetishize the stratification of the human lifespan in various kinds of ways. The university is perhaps the locus classicus of the intergenerational conversation. How do you envisage it centering the conditions of its knowledge production in order to transform itself from the engine for the reproduction of bourgeois capitalism?
Please go ahead, guys. Okay. I have an answer too, but I'll wait.
I mean, I'll just say quickly, so Rutgers has a union that's faculty, it's grad employees, and it's adjuncts, all within one local. And that's new. The grad employees and the part-time lecturers came in more recently. And this isn't a great answer to your question, but I think one thing that has emerged since that's happened is that the union has completely revitalized. And it's moved from something that was a little more trade unionist and focused on contract to something that's fighting for the future of the university. And so and I think that's because of the influx of young people, grad employees, but also then a step towards working much closer with student organizers that moved us to fight for a sanctuary campus on the campus, which we won, and has helped us fight against student debt with students. So for me, though, I think there's probably many avenues, but certainly the union, and I think we're lucky in the States to have a union that's wall-to-wall like that. But nonetheless, the union has changed with the influx of young people, and that's changed how we fight over the future of the university.
So we are out of time, but please join me in thanking our panel again.